meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, the Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Before beginning, I wanted to tell you that I do have a title for the sermon. It's just very difficult for me to get the title in about 3 weeks in advance of preaching the sermon. And the title of this sermon is "The Splendid Loaf and the Essential Ingredient." What is most essential for us? What is the foundation for everything else? The one ingredient we must have in order to survive and flourish. I have enjoyed baking bread for many years, so when I began to think about ingredients, I thought about all the ingredients for my favorite pumpernickel bread. My pumpernickel bread has 10 ingredients. First, I boil some water and pour the boiling water into an enormous glass bowl with oats and currants and chopped dried peaches and molasses. After the water has cooled to room temperature, I begin to add other ingredients: yeast, salt, rye flour, and whole wheat flour. I mix it up into a sticky mass and let it rise. After an hour or two, I punch the dough down and begin to add some white flour, just a handful at a time. When the dough begins to pull away from the sides of the bowl, I know it is time to turn the dough out onto the counter. Then I sprinkle a few chopped pecans on top of the dough and mix it just a little bit more, using a spatula to fold the dough over on itself. I let the dough rest for 20 minutes or so. Then I bake it in a very hot oven in a heavy porcelain glazed cast iron pot. And that is how I make a beautiful loaf of bread. This is what it looks like. I have to tell you, I don't bake it very often during the summer, but yesterday seemed like the time to do it. But let's pretend we don't have all those ingredients. In fact, let's pretend we have to choose just one ingredient. What is most essential for a baker? What is the one ingredient you must have in order to bake bread? Nope. Flour. You must have flour. If you have flour and water, you can bake a very simple kind of bread. When you finish baking the dough, it will look something like this, and you will call it a matzo, or a tortilla, or a chapati. I baked this little loaf of unleavened bread this morning in my cast iron griddle. I had to think about that one myself. There's a reason almost every culture has their own version of this sort of bread. It's because when people are in very difficult times, when there is a war, or when there is a drought, or when people are very poor, they cannot find or afford to buy yeast and salt and molasses and all those other ingredients. So people everywhere have discovered that if you have flour, you can mix it with water and make a very simple sort of bread. And that bread will sustain you through a difficult time. It's important to know what is essential in life. For a baker, the essential ingredient is flour. For an athlete or performer, the essential ingredient is focus. For a musician, the essential ingredient is listening. For a family, the essential ingredient is love. In the story of Mary and Martha, Mary shows us what is essential in our spiritual lives. Mary listened to God. This is a powerful story. Many of us know it well. Many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the story of Mary and Martha. Raise your hand if you spent some time thinking about the story of Mary and Martha. All right. I have. Personally, sometimes I feel a little exhausted and even a little beat up by some of the sermons and thoughts I've heard about this story. I feel a little tired when I begin to think of the story of Mary and Martha as an either-or story. Sometimes I feel like my choice is to either act more like Mary and slow down and just get really good at being quiet and being with God and leaving everything else behind, or I will end up like a bad version of Martha. Sometimes the story of Mary and Martha seems like an either-or story. But I've done enough cooking and cleaning in my life to know that affirming Mary without affirming Martha would not be the whole truth. The truth of our lives is that God includes all of the truths and all of the kinds of work and all of the people in the story. Let's think about Mary, and then let's think about Martha. Mary sat down in the presence of Jesus and ended up sitting down in the presence of God. We don't live in Jesus' time, so most of us have either forgot or just don't know that Jesus and Mary are breaking some of the central rules of their time. Women were not supposed to sit and talk with men. Men were specifically instructed in the Jewish commentary of the scriptures, called the Midrash, to not sit with women, and were told to not waste their time talking with women. Mary is Jesus' example of the person who loves God. Mary is the person who chooses the best, the most important thing to do. And Mary breaks the rules of her culture in order to do the most important thing, which is to be in God's presence. Mary does not do what everyone else expects her to do. Mary takes a risk in order to be in a different place. Has this been true for you in your life? Have there been times when you found yourself moving closer to God by moving beyond what people expected you to do? You and I don't have the opportunity to literally sit at Jesus' feet and listen. Where are the places you hear God speak to you? Mary shows us what is most essential. The absolute necessity of our spiritual life is to listen to God. But Mary is not the only person in the story. So let's think about Martha. Jesus rebukes Martha after Martha tries to force Mary to join her in the kitchen. But Jesus does not rebuke Martha for preparing the meal. Jesus tells us that the most important thing is to spend time with God. But Jesus does not say that the work of preparing the meal is not important. Jesus makes it clear that the most important thing is to spend time with God. The words of Jesus and the love of God are very real to me. They are very real to me in large part due to hundreds of people, including a great many people who did the important work of Mary and of Martha. I have known a few people like Mary, people who would do anything to find a way to spend quiet time listening to God, even if it meant breaking some rules in order to do it. I have known many wonderful people who supported the entire life of the church by cooking the meals and washing the dishes and mending the choir robes and setting the table for communion. They serve God's people in practical ways, the way Martha does. This is not an either-or decision for us. We need both. We need to settle ourselves down and listen to God, and we need to do all the work that makes this place a place of fellowship and stability. We need to learn from Mary. We can get very busy with other kinds of work. Sometimes we forget that worship is the central work of the church. If we want to flourish in our spiritual lives, we also need to find other ways to be in the divine presence that is the source of our being. Because 1 hour a week or 1 hour a month will leave us weak and struggling to survive. Trying to live the spiritual life without setting aside time with God would be like trying to make bread without any flour. What would happen if I mixed up some yeast and molasses and salt with water, but I didn't add any flour? The yeast would show a little bit of movement for a few minutes, but nothing would happen in the end. In the end, the yeast will die, and I will be left with a bowl of salty water. But living the spiritual life with any of the Martha work, without any of the practical work, would leave behind the richness and the fullness of God's people. Here is a truth known by millions of people who have washed the dishes and cooked the food and set the table at church dinners and in homes for 2,000 years since Martha welcomed Jesus into her home. We have to do both. We have to set aside time to stop working and just be with God. And we have to take some time to wash the dishes and balance the checkbook and repair the roof. Both of these ideas are true. Worship is the central activity of the church. And there is a richness, a joy, a flourishing that happens when people bring different passions, different gifts, and different ingredients. Just as we would never think of trying to bake a loaf of bread without any flour, we should never forget the essential ingredient of our spiritual lives. But just as we find great joy in a splendid loaf of bread, and I really had to restrain myself from cutting off some of this yesterday and eating it, we find great joy in the diverse passions, gifts, and works of our church.